This is not a comprehensive history of SSC Napoli or Diego Maradona. It's not a complete biography of the man, and we are not covering everything that has happened and is happening to the football club. It's also not a complete history of either Naples or Italy. It's one story, a single thread running through the fabric of football. We liked it and thought you might too, but we also want to do the club and people involved justice. So if you think we've missed or misrepresented any points, or can think of push-off points for future videos, please let us know in the comments. Diego Maradona's move to Napoli wasn't straightforward. Despite wanting to sell a player who courted controversy at every turn, Barcelona knew full well the prodigious talent they had under contract. And to add a new dimension to the dilemma, Napoli simply couldn't afford Barcelona's asking price of £6.9 million or $10.48 million outright. But like many clubs, Napoli had monitored Maradona since his Argentinos juniors days. Corrado Faleno simply couldn't let the now tantalizing prospect of finally signing the Argentine for his beloved club and ailing city slip away. Fortunately, a serendipitous backdoor into this club-altering transfer soon opened. In 1984, Vincenzo Scotti, a good friend of Faleno, was the newly installed mayor of Naples. Faleno convinced Scotti that signing Maradona would be a huge boon for the city. They just needed to convince Banco di Napoli to finance the deal. So that's what they did. However, the full financing of the transfer caused some stinging debate. Fingers pointed at involvement with organized crime, namely the Camorra. One suggestion, as highlighted by author Jimmy Burns, was that the Camorra, who sold Napoli tickets illegally, would benefit hugely from the expected tripling of attendances at the Stadio San Paolo. At Maradona's unveiling press conference, French journalist Alain Cheyou stunned the packed room by asking Diego directly whether he was aware that the mafia had helped to bankroll his transfer. Maradona, like everyone else gathered in the room, remained silent. Faleno interjected with an impassioned dressing down. Cheyou was subsequently removed from the room. But no matter how the transfer was financed, negotiations dragged on for some time. Naturally, Barcelona wanted to squeeze the best possible deal out of the Neapolitans. What would you do if you were selling Diego Maradona? On the last day of the transfer window, Faleno claims that he dropped off an empty envelope at the Serie A offices in Milan, which was supposed to contain Maradona's contract with Napoli. He then travelled to Barcelona to finally complete the deal before the window closed. When he had Diego's signed contract in hand, Faleno put it in an envelope and returned to Milan. Back at the Serie A offices, he switched the old decoy envelope for the new one after the deadline. Some journalists caught wind of this, but it seemed the authorities were happy to have Maradona in Serie A and with a struggling club like Napoli, so they ignored the story. Maradona, then, was a Napoli player. How much he knew about his new destination is up for debate. When asked by a reporter, "What do you expect from the city of Naples?" Maradona replied, "Well, I expect peace. The peace I didn't have in Barcelona. But above all, respect." Maradona's words underline his feelings about his time in Barcelona. For all those who loved him, there was no escaping the lack of respect for who he was as a person and where he had come from. But it also shows a startling lack of knowledge about the city he was moving to. For all of its charms, peace is not a word often used to describe Naples. In El Diego, he admits his obliviousness outright. "I didn't know Naples. I didn't know Italy, but there wasn't another team that would buy me." But if the unknowns of his new home and the seeming poverty of his new club left room for Diego to doubt, the Napoli fans made a huge statement on the day he arrived. At his stadium unveiling on the 5th of July 1984, Between 70 and 90,000 rambunctious fans showed up to roar their welcome. A further 253 journalists and 78 photographers only added to the mayhem. This was a fiery, ferocious love from day one. Maradona was now the idol of the urchins, the downtrodden, and he wanted to speak up for them. It didn't take long for Diego to see how fans north of Naples viewed his team and the city it played in. He made his Napoli debut away in Verona. The home fans displayed a banner that read, "Welcome to Italy." And this was just the beginning. As Napoli travelled around Italy, some of the words in chants from opposition fans included, "Even the dogs run too. The Neapolitans are coming. You are the shame of the whole of Italy. Sick with cholera, victims of the earthquake, you never washed with soap. Napoli shit, Napoli cholera. Wash them, wash them, wash them with fire. O Vesuvio, wash them with fire." The reference to cholera relates to Naples' 1973 pandemic, Europe's last cholera outbreak. In Calcio, a history of Italian football, quoting Papa Ampanico, John Foote describes what away matches for Napoli were like at this time. Matches with northern teams took on all the significance of a cultural and ethnic challenge. Maradona's arrival in Naples inevitably sparked an interest among the city's most powerful and influential. Despite fighting a brutal civil war, the Camorra was at the peak of its power in the 1980s. The Giulianos from Forcella were among the most prominent figures in one of the Nova Familia's most important clans. According to Maradona himself, he met the Giuliano family after a Napoli fan invited him to their home. To cut a long story short, the Giulianos said they would protect Maradona and his family. With that protection came cocaine on demand. But this relationship ran two ways. Because Maradona relied on the Giuliano family, he became their property. He was essentially at their beck and call, wheeled out to bring his star power to inaugurating businesses they had interests in, among other things. Still, he seemed to get a Rolex for every appearance. Protected, indulged, and adored. Maradona was home. In his first season, Napoli finished 8th in a 16-team Serie A. But this was a campaign of transition, as Maradona adapted to the new rhythms of Italian football. The squad was poor too, having only narrowly avoided relegation the year before. Maradona's second season, 1985-86, saw a huge improvement. The squad was evolving, Falerno hired Ottavio Bianchi as manager, and Diego had firmly found his feet in Serie A. Napoli finished third as their star Argentine prepared to wow the planet at the World Cup in Mexico. But more on that later. Spoiler alert, Diego returned to Naples for the 1986-87 season as a world champion and the undisputed greatest player in the world. Alongside Maradona's irrepressible form, a young Ciro Ferrara earned his breakthrough in defence. Two new signings, Andrea Carnevale and the rather appropriately named Fernando de Napoli, were also key in pushing the squad over the edge. On the 10th of May 1987, the prayed-for day finally arrived. Following a 1-1 draw at home to Fiorentina, Napoli were crowned champions of Italy for the first time in their history. The colossal occasion sparked fanatical celebrations across the city. In Calcio, John Foote describes the scenes as the greatest series of celebrations ever seen in domestic football. But the history makers weren't finished there. A month later, Napoli went on to beat Atalanta 4-0 on aggregate in a two-legged final to add the Coppa Italia, securing a historic double. Summing up this momentous season, Ciro Ferrara said, "The victory marked the social redemption of our city." During these early days of unparalleled success, most of Maradona's misdemeanors remained under wraps. He was Santa Maradona, Saint Maradona. Naples' primary patron saint, it has more than 50 official patron saints, San Gennaro, became San Gennarmando. Eduardo Galeano also reflected on this glory-laden period in Football in Sun and Shadow. Thanks to Maradona, the Dark South had finally managed to humiliate the White North that scorned it. Gossip about Diego's cocaine addiction, rampant sex life, and Comorra connections still swirled around the city streets. But in a pre-internet era, word didn't, or wasn't allowed to, travel far. Nothing ever stuck to Diego, not even the claim that he had fathered a child with a local woman named Cristina Sinagra. She had had a 4-month affair with Diego, during which she fell pregnant. To underline her point, she named her son Diego Armando Maradona Sinagra, and he later became known as Diego Maradona Jr. Maradona wasn't confirmed as the boy's biological father until 1993. He was made to support the child, but he still ignored him for a further decade until their first meeting in 2003. It wasn't until 2007 that he finally recognized Diego Jr. as his son. Over 3 unprecedented years, Maradona had cemented a godlike legacy in Naples. And in the middle of it all, he had the chance to show the world what they were missing. According to fitness coach Fernando Signorini, Maradona arrived in Mexico in 1986 like a well-tuned violin. With his weight stabilized at 76 kilos, he was in the best shape of his life. And when he met up with his compatriots, he was riding a wave of incredible form for his club. Napoli had finished third in Diego's second season, and only Michel Platini, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge and Roberto Pruzzo scored more Serie A goals than the Argentine. But it wasn't just Maradona who was at peak fitness. Before they had left, manager Carlos Bilardo had drilled his squad in the blazing mid-afternoon sunshine in Tilcara. He had chosen this small town in the desert near the Chilean border, 3,000 meters above sea level, to simulate the heat and elevation of the upcoming games in Mexico. By the time they arrived in Mexico City, the team was feeling confident and prepared. As ever, Diego was mobbed by reporters, and he openly embraced the spotlight at media events. On the eve of the tournament, the front page of one Spanish-language newspaper featured a photo of Maradona with a beaming smile. The headline read, "I will be the star of the World Cup." And so it was foretold. Argentina came flying out of the traps. Their first game was a solid 3-1 victory over South Korea, in which Maradona shone. His performance was made all the more remarkable by the fact that the Koreans adopted a familiar tactic, deliberately targeting Diego with aggressive treatment, kicking him whenever he even came close to the ball. Maradona's response? 3 sublime assists for teammates Valdano and Ruggeri. Signorini describes his performance thus: the physical preparation and internal fire had made him an unstoppable bulldozer, who also threw rays of genius, like the goal that he scored against Italy. The goal against Italy, a through ball over the back line, pace and strength to beat his man, the incredible leap and stretch to reach a ball that seems to be heading far too wide, the single deft touch that brings it back across the keeper and nestles it into the far bottom corner. Or the cross for the final goal in the Bulgaria game. Left foot, first time, whipped into Burruchaga, unmarked at the back post for a powerful header. Argentina, undefeated, progressed to the knockout rounds, top of their group. It was here that Diego really began to shine. In the round of 16, Uruguay set up defensively in an effort to contain Maradona, but he danced through the defence at will, torturing defenders and delivering teasing balls into the box that his teammates were agonisingly unable to finish. In the end, it took a scrappy goal from Pedro Pasculi to win the game. But Argentina had absolutely dominated, and they were threatening to run riot in advance of the quarterfinals and what was to become, undoubtedly, the most controversial game of the tournament. But before that, some context. In 1982, the military junta that ruled Argentina was faced with growing discontent at home. It was an active participant in Operation Condor, a US-backed campaign of political repression in South America. The regime had carried out mass human rights violations, including kidnapping, torture, and assassinations of left-wing political dissidents such as students, trade unionists, and even priests. In addition, the country's economic situation was rapidly deteriorating. For example, the year 1981 saw inflation reach 600%. The junta was desperate and increasingly relied on patriotic rhetoric to rally its population. In turn, this rhetoric caused it to clash with neighboring countries such as Chile over territorial disputes. As the political situation worsened, the language intensified, and the junta turned to an issue that had long wounded patriotic pride. Las Malvinas, as they called them in Spanish. In March, the United Kingdom withdrew its only military vessel from what they call the Falkland Islands. The junta interpreted this as a display of unwillingness to defend the archipelago. Thus, in April, the junta mounted an amphibious invasion, codenamed Operation Rosario. The regime had gambled. It had staked its entire future on reclaiming a territory that the country had previously owned for less than 18 months of its 200 years of inhabitation. Margaret Thatcher was also in need of a patriotic bullhorn. She had come into power promising to revitalize Britain, to reduce inflation, deregulate markets, privatize state-owned companies, and attack the entrenched power of the trade unions. But Britain fell into a deep depression, and by 1980, the Prime Minister's approval rating stood at 23%. In 1981, riots erupted across major British cities. By 82, unemployment was over 3 million. Under such circumstances, then, it was no wonder that Thatcher grasped with both hands the opportunity afforded to her by Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands. Two governments on the rocks, so to speak. Both of them rolled the dice. To cut a short story about a short war even shorter, the conflict lasted 74 days. A Royal Navy task force was dispatched in advance of an amphibious assault to restore control of the islands to Great Britain. The Argentinian conscripts had been poorly prepared for the war. More than 11,000 of them were captured, and they surrendered on June 14, 1982. 649 Argentine military personnel, 255 British troops, and 3 Falkland Islanders had been killed. Thatcher had overseen a swift and effective military victory, and her popularity soared. The Iron Lady was re-elected in 1983 and would go on to become the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the 20th century. In Argentina, the backlash began. An infamous headline during the conflict had exclaimed, "Estamos ganando," "We're winning." But the outcome of the conflict suddenly exposed the propaganda as hollow and hastened the regime's demise. On June the 18th, just 4 days after surrender, General Leopoldo Galtieri received a letter demanding that he resign. The junta began shredding documents that evidenced their murder of between 15 and 30,000 dissidents. Meanwhile, Argentinians took to the streets. The transition to democracy had begun. But Argentinian patriotic pride had been dealt a heavy blow. In Asif Kapadia's 2019 documentary, Maradona echoes a familiar sentiment. We, as Argentinians, didn't know what the military was up to. They told us that we were winning the war, but in reality, England was winning 20-0. It was tough. And this was the atmosphere in which, 4 years later, Argentina came up against England in the quarterfinals of the World Cup in Mexico. After England's victory over Paraguay, when it became clear that the two teams had been drawn together, the expectation and tension rose over 4 sweltering days into a roaring crescendo. The British media had a field day, or as Maradona recalls, the hype made it seem like we were going to play out another war. Somehow, we blamed the English players for everything that had happened, for everything that the Argentinian people had suffered. The feeling was stronger than us. We were defending our flag, the dead kids, the survivors. Terry Fenwick, the England player tasked with marking Maradona that day, remembers the heightened security that was suddenly thrust upon them. We had 3 guys with machine guns travelling on board, and a whole host of military vehicles following behind. We had never come across the like before. It was frightening. But on the pitch, England were feeling confident. They entered the tournament on the back of a dozen qualifying matches undefeated. They too had held a training camp at altitude in the Colorado Rockies, and after adjusting to the Mexican heat, they had picked up confidence and form, coming into the game on the back of 2 3-0 victories. The tension and the heat built throughout the days leading up to the match. Fighting between Argentinian and English fans in the streets before the game spilled over into the stands. On the edge of Mexico City, with 114,580 people in attendance, the Estadio Azteca was a bristling cauldron of violent anticipation. The game didn't disappoint. The English took the kickoff, and the game immediately jumped into life. In the 7th minute, Peter Reid was sent flying. In the 9th, Fenwick was booked for lunging at a ball that the toes of Maradona had kept tantalizingly out of reach. This set the tone, tempers flaring, with Maradona probing the English defence, and the English, like so many teams before them, trying to bully him off the ball. But come half-time, the game was still level, goalless, and on a knife edge. But that all changed 6 minutes after the restart. I knew it was my hand. It wasn't my plan, but the action happened so fast that the linesman didn't see me putting my hand in. The referee looked at me and he said, "Goal." It was a nice feeling, like some sort of symbolic revenge against the English. We all know the story by now. The image of Peter Shilton, England's goalkeeper, and 8 inches taller than Maradona, enmeshed with Diego, mid-air, for the briefest moment, in the glaring midday Mexican sun. Maradona wheeling away towards the screaming crowds of the Azteca. Shilton and the closest England players raising their hands, appealing towards Ali bin Nasser, the referee. When confronted by the media post-game, Maradona stated, "It was a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God." Bobby Robson, then England manager, saw it a little differently. The first goal was a disgrace. It was handball and it was a dreadful mistake. But the second goal was a miracle, one of the most brilliant I have ever seen. The second goal. It was quite possibly the greatest individual goal in football history. Goal of the century. In the space of 4 minutes, the game had been turned on its head by the hand of God and the quick feet and rapid brain of Diego Armando Maradona. The match against England is the perfect example of the Maradona mythology. 2 goals, one through deception, cheating, the other a show of sublime genius. He is loved, he is hated. Maradona once again excelled in the semi-finals, torturing the Belgian defence with attack after rapid attack. He scored both of the game's goals. The first, a deft touch past 2 defenders and the onrushing keeper. The second, a mazy slalom through 4 flummoxed Belgian defenders, withstanding a butcheresque last-ditch tackle from Eric Gerets, the Belgian captain, and a finish expertly lifted over the keeper, Jean-Marie Pfaff. In the space of 4 days, Maradona had scored 2 of the greatest goals ever in a World Cup, and Argentina had made the final. On the 29th of June, Argentina once again lined up at the Estadio Azteca, their 3rd game in 7 days, the 1986 World Cup final. Undefeated, the Argentinians were feeling confident. Maradona was already regarded as the player of the tournament. But the Germans were not going to take the threat of Argentina's talisman lightly, and Lothar Matthäus closely marked Maradona throughout the match, denying him game-changing influence that he had commanded in previous rounds. Argentina went in at half-time 1-0 up, a goalkeeping error by Harald Schumacher, the only difference between the teams. Valdano made it 2 in the 56th minute, but Germany pulled 2 goals back in the space of 7 late minutes, and with less than 10 to go, the match was heading for extra time. As both teams wilted in the closing stages, a loose ball bounced in midfield. It pinballed around the centre circle as both teams struggled to regain possession. Maradona headed the ball out towards Riccardo Giusti, who quickly headed it back under pressure from his marker. All of a sudden, after what started as an innocent-looking exchange, Maradona found himself away from Matthäus, in a couple of yards of space, at the centre of a diamond of German players. He let the ball bounce once to his left side and shifted his weight. That left foot lofted a waist-height through ball past the point of the diamond, and Jorge Burruchaga was away. He sprinted, gathering the last reserves of energy in his tired legs. After what looks like a heavy touch, Burruchaga taps it under the on-rushing Schumacher, who made his rush too late. The ball settled in the back corner of the goal. The Azteca exploded, and Argentina secured their second World Cup. And there's absolutely no doubt who takes the golden ball as player of the tournament. The name on the lips of every football aficionado and the typeface of every sports journalist the world over. Diego Armando Maradona. In the summer of 1987, Diego Maradona was 26 years old. In the previous 12 months, he had led the perennial underachievers of Napoli to an unprecedented League and Coppa Italia double, and a good but not great Argentina to World Cup glory. The city of Naples worshipped him. Argentina deified him. Life in his unreal bubble of adulation and addiction was positively golden. In the 1987-88 season, Napoli set about defending their title. Maradona himself regarded the campaign as one of his very best. He scored against every team in Serie A on his way to winning the Capocannoniere for top goalscorer. Napoli exploded into the season, their ruthless form taking them to the top of the table and keeping them there. The Brazilian striker Careca signed for Napoli from Sao Paulo that summer and joined Maradona and Bruno Giordano to form the front line known as Magica. The trio immediately struck fear into Serie A defences. Arrigo Sacchi's Milan, with new signings Marco van Basten and Ruud Gullit, were taking time to gel, and at Juventus, Ian Rush had replaced the retired Michel Platini, and the results were far from impressive. Heading into the last 5 fixtures of the season, Napoli had only lost 2 games. They were 4 points clear of Milan, and this in an era of 2 points for a win. But those last 5 games produced no victories. First, they lost 3-1 to Juventus in Turin. They then drew 1-1 away at Verona. A huge showdown with Milan in Naples then followed. They lost 3-2 in what is considered an all-time Serie A classic. At the final whistle, the San Paolo fell into a deafening silence, but the crowd then rose as one to offer both teams a standing ovation. Still, the result crushed Napoli. Milan left Naples with a 1-point lead. By his own admission, Maradona was fucked, injured, and claimed that there was nowhere left on my lower back or knee for a needle to go in. The ailing superstar missed the final 2 games of the season, a 3-2 defeat at Fiorentina and a 2-1 loss at home to Sampdoria. Napoli finished second, 3 points behind Milan, who also didn't win either of their final 2 games. This was the Rossoneri's first title since 1979, and their first in the Berlusconi era. Napoli's collapse was so spectacular that a conspiracy soon swirled around the city's tight streets and narrow alleys. Before the season started, Neapolitans flocked in droves to bet on their team retaining the championship. These bets were placed on the black market, or totonero, a lucrative revenue stream for the Camorra. There's a lack of hard evidence, but it is assumed that a Napoli title win would have been a huge financial hit for the city's crime families. In a Guardian article by Tim Lewis, investigative journalist Simone De Meo is quoted as saying, if they had won that season, the Camorra would have had to pay out about 200 billion lira in bets. They would have gone bankrupt. Sporting collapses happen. There are many examples spread across multiple disciplines, both teams and individuals. But it's worth noting that in the run-in of the 87-88 season, Maradona's car was vandalized, and his teammate, Salvatore Bagni, had his home broken into twice. So, was the collapse tied to organized crime? Were Napoli just wilting after finally securing the success they craved? Had Maradona's hunger started to dwindle after so much personal glory? Surely such a competitive sportsman would want to win. Or were his feelings on the matter irrelevant? There were even whispers, unsubstantiated of course, that Berlusconi might have had an influence. He was about to announce his first foray into politics and wouldn't want to look like a failure from the off, especially at the hands of Napoli. After all, as Eduardo Galeano points out in Football in Sun and Shadow, in Milan, they hated the man responsible for this affront by the uppity poor. They called him Ham with curls. Napoli kept on winning cup after cup, and each goal constituted a desecration of the established order and a revenge against history. Unfortunately, questions are all anyone has. There are no answers, and people in Naples still don't like talking about the one that got away. For his part, Maradona absolutely refutes any claims of conspiracy, although, at the time, he did send Claudia and Dalma, his wife and daughter, back to Buenos Aires for their safety. 4 Napoli players, Ferrario, Bagni, Garella and Giordano, blamed the manager, Bianchi, for the failure. They even issued a statement calling for his dismissal, but the club backed the manager and sold the dissenters. In the 1988-89 season, Inter romped the championship by 11 points, but again, Napoli finished second. The previous season's second place had also qualified them for the UEFA Cup. Unlike in previous years, Napoli produced an outstanding European campaign. They defeated Juventus and Bayern Munich en route to the final where, over 2 legs, they defeated Stuttgart 5-4 on aggregate. Illustrious European silverware now glistened alongside their domestic honours. During the 88-89 season, Maradona had started to entertain his first serious thoughts of leaving Napoli. Bernard Tapie's Marseille were interested and willing to pay Diego whatever he wanted. Before the semi-final against Bayern Munich, Maradona claims that President Corrado Faleno promised him a transfer to France if he helped Napoli win the UEFA Cup. In the heated aftermath of the victory against Stuttgart, Diego said to the president, "It's done. I did everything I had to do. I can go." The intensity of the previous 5 years had caught up with him. Claudia Villafañe, Diego's long-term girlfriend, then wife and mother of his legitimate children, said it was impossible. They had so much hope, and when Diego delivered, it was like, he saved us, he chose us, he became a god. Fernando Signorini, Diego's personal trainer, recalled, "The affection was too clingy and too uncomfortable. After he underwent a blood test, the nurse took the phial of Diego's blood and placed it in the church of San Gennaro like he was a demigod. It disturbed him psychologically." The problem was, Faleno had no intention of selling his biggest asset, and in the pre-Bosman age, he held all the power. The president said the promise was only motivation. The Argentine was under contract and not for sale. A war of words ensued. The scale of the rift was obvious. Around this time, old photos of Diego partying in a jacuzzi with Camorra bosses finally found their way into a city magazine, Il Mattino, denting his reputation among many in Naples. Accusations and rumours hurried around the city and beyond. The heat from the fire reached Maradona in Argentina. Facing an unpleasant backlash and bitter with disdain for what he saw as Faleno's betrayal, Diego decided against returning. Allegedly, he passed on over 30 flights back to Italy. Maradona missed the first month of the 1989-90 season, but eventually returned, making his first appearance in mid-September. This was now a man brimming with anger and frustration, feelings he channeled into phenomenal performances that inspired a run to Napoli's second championship. To put things in perspective, they finished 2 points clear of the incredible Milan team of Baresi, Costacurta, Maldini, Donadoni, Rijkaard, Hullit and Van Basten, the side that won their second consecutive European Cup that same season. But Maradona was losing his grip, not just on himself, but on his reputation. His trainer, Signorini, says this was the point when Diego, the boy from the slums with insecurities and fears, finally succumbed to Maradona. the persona he had built to handle the media spotlight and pressures of elite sport. By his own admission, Maradona's routine had descended into a farce. He would play a game on a Sunday before going out for dinner with the team. He then left his wife and kids at home and went out to a club to drink, party, and take cocaine. This last part could go on until the Wednesday. Around this time, he would cleanse for the next game on the following Sunday. To put it mildly, this was not sustainable. On Italy's national political landscape, north-south tensions were reaching extreme levels. Lega Nord was formed in December 1989, and their propaganda drew heavily on anti-southern prejudice. Essentially, they wanted the prosperous northern regions to secede from the south. And as fires broke out in this increasingly hostile environment, the 1990 World Cup trundled over the horizon like a rusting oil tanker. Italy hosted the 1990 World Cup, and the Azzurri were one of the favourites to win the competition. Maradona's Argentina were defending champions, but the Albiceleste squad was in considerably worse shape than 4 years previous. Diego himself personified this. The previous Serie A season had taken a toll on him. While he may have helped to inspire another championship for Napoli, he faced all the same adoration and expectations. His muse was no longer joy and determination, but the far more draining force of anger. He continued his slide into addiction. His weight fluctuated. He had a persistent knee problem, and, after years of attention from Serie A defenders, his ankles were delicate and prone to swelling up to the point of barely functioning. Still, another nation would need to prise Maradona's fingers from that glistening golden trophy. In the opening game of the tournament, Argentina played Cameroon at San Siro in Milan. The Argentine anthem was booed, as was Maradona. In fact, he was constantly booed throughout the tournament. Recalling Italia 90 in Calcio, John Foote writes, "Naples, the South, and Argentina were all grouped together by Italy's fans, especially those in the North. This meant that Argentina and their captain received a hostile greeting wherever they went, other than Naples, of course." After a shock defeat to the Cameroonians in the curtain raiser, Maradona didn't opt for diplomacy in a post-match interview. "My only pleasure this afternoon was in discovering the Italians in Milan have stopped being racists. Today, for the first time, they supported the Africans." Argentina somehow muddled their way through the group and subsequent knockout rounds, defeating Brazil and Yugoslavia on their way to the semi-finals. Only one more opponent lay between them and a place in their second consecutive final: Italy. The Azzurri had ridden a wave of raucous home support to this stage. A huge factor in their drive through the tournament was the fact that they played every game at Rome's rambunctious Stadio Olimpico. But the FIGC, the Italian Football Association, hadn't designated the Olimpico as a semi-final venue. So while England and West Germany faced off in Turin, Italy and Argentina would meet at the Stadio San Paolo in Naples. During the build-up to the game, Maradona felt he was as much on home turf as the Italians. After all, he more than anyone had wholeheartedly embraced the city. That goes some way to explaining his famous, or infamous, comments. The Neapolitans are being asked to be Italians for one night, while the other 364 days of the year they get called terroni, an Italian slur roughly translated as peasants. I only want respect for the Neapolitans. I know they are Italians. We cannot ask for them to cheer for us, but the rest of Italy should know the people of Naples are just as Italian as they are. The comments infuriated Italy and unsettled the national team. On the evening of the semi-final, the San Paolo was split. Maradona was their idol, a man worthy of worship. But now he was framed as the devil, poking the open wound of the Italian divide and trying to knock them out of their home World Cup. In the Golazzo episode, Maradona's Napoli, James Horncastle says, "The players for Italy throughout that tournament had played at the Olimpico in Rome. They said the atmosphere was different in Naples because they couldn't root against Maradona. They couldn't go against the guy who delivered everything they ever dreamed of." A team playing in a semi-final at a home World Cup can usually rely on a partisan crowd roaring them on, but this simply wasn't the case in Naples. Some banners read, "Maradona, Naples loves you, but Italy is our homeland," and "Diego in our hearts, Italy in our songs." But the Neapolitans were evidently torn, indecisive, and didn't fully commit. The Argentinian anthem was, for the first time in the tournament, met with respectful silence. After a 1-1 draw in normal time and a scoreless extra time, the game went to penalties. Both sides converted their first 3 spot kicks. Roberto Donadoni took Italy's 4th, but Sergio Goycochea dived to his left and parried the ball clear. Maradona strode forward for Argentina's 4th penalty. He calmly slotted in, sending Zenga the wrong way. He celebrated as though it was the winning kick, but Argentina weren't quite there yet. Aldo Serena stepped up for Italy's 5th spot kick. He put his laces through it, but his effort was nowhere near the corner. Goycochea guessed right and saved. Argentina were in the final. In the face of this perceived treachery, the press unloaded on Maradona. Just some headlines from the time include, "Maradona is the devil, the obnoxious one. Lucifer lives in Naples." In a La Repubblica poll, he was voted the most hated person in Italy, beating politicians and dictators to top spot. 74,000 people attended the World Cup final in the Stadio Olimpico, and there wasn't a single neutral among them. The Argentine anthem was booed vociferously, a clear demonstration of the ill feeling toward Maradona. He made his thoughts on the matter clear. West Germany won quite possibly the worst World Cup final in history, at least until the next one. The curtain fell on Italia 90 on the 8th of July, but it had already come down on Maradona's relationship with Napoli and Italy 5 nights earlier at the San Paolo. The country had irreversibly turned on him. His downfall accelerated. The breakup was coming, and it wasn't going to be clean. Maradona started the 1990-91 season at Napoli, but the clock was ticking and everyone could hear it. Following the World Cup, Maradona was reviled by many Italians, and hostile crowds around the country made their feelings clear. It was painfully apparent that Maradona wanted to leave Italy, but he was still under contract and the club wasn't selling. In Football in Sun and Shadow, Eduardo Galeano summarized the increasingly somber situation. Prisoner of the city that adored him, and of the Camorra, the mafia that owns it, he was playing against his heart, against his feet. As his disenchantment grew, Maradona's professionalism sunk to new lows. He rarely trained and looked increasingly out of shape. The first flashpoint of the season came in November 1990. Having drawn 0-0 in the first leg of a European Cup last 16 tie with Spartak Moscow, Napoli flew to the Russian capital for the second leg, except Maradona wasn't aboard the plane. Following an alleged night out fueled by sex and drugs, he had locked himself in his flat and refused to join his teammates. After sobering up, Diego flew by private jet to Moscow the night before the game at his own expense. But he arrived so late that the hotel's kitchen had closed. Annoyed, Maradona decided to head out into the Russian night. At around 2 in the morning, he visited Red Square. The Russian police, accompanying him, explained that the square was closed off because the October Revolution anniversary celebrations were taking place the next day. By now, the word "no" was alien to Maradona. Convincing the guards to break the strictest levels of protocol, he was allowed in, given a guided tour, and even visited Lenin's mausoleum. Infuriated, Napoli finally felt the need to punish their fading superstar. He started the game on the bench, coming on as a second-half substitute. But even when he finally entered the game, he couldn't muster the inspiration of old. Spartak beat Napoli on penalties. Now aged 30 and seemingly in rapid decline, Napoli's willingness to indulge his excesses was wearing thin. The glory that used to go some way to excuse such behaviour was no longer there. Following his erratic behaviour, Maradona became the scapegoat for Napoli's early exit from the European Cup. But far worse was to come. At 3:30 a.m. on the 7th of January 1991, Diego Maradona called an associate to order 2 prostitutes. He was isolated, a prisoner in his own home, hounded by the media, exhausted from the incessant attention of fame, and hopelessly addicted to cocaine. In a tragicomic twist, the female contact who talked to Maradona asked that he say hello to her Napoli-obsessed son. He asked him what had happened in a recent game and whether or not he was staying at the club. It was around this time that a tribunal fined Maradona $70,000 for missing training sessions and games with Napoli. The club had also taken legal action against him, claiming that his misbehavior was tarnishing their image. Little did Maradona, or anyone else involved, know that Italian authorities were recording the phone call as part of Operation China, a wiretapping investigation related to drug trafficking. In fact, Maradona's voice appeared in several other calls from around the same time in which drugs and requests for prostitutes were openly discussed. The Camorra controlled prostitution in Naples, so the lady Maradona used to call in such cases was part of the Forcella criminal system. The sting had ensnared an almighty catch. The phone calls were used to bring charges against Diego, including possession and handling of drugs, and possession of drugs with the purpose of trafficking. The latter charge was because he offered cocaine to his female companions, and it came with a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Maradona went to trial and made a plea bargain. He was cleared of any involvement in drug trafficking, but was charged with cocaine possession. Diego received a suspended sentence of 1 year and 2 months in jail and a 5 million lira fine. Diego's relationship with the Giuliano family was now causing headaches for the entire Camorra. They liked to work in the shadows, but the spotlight on Maradona was inching ever closer their way. The protective bubble around Maradona finally burst. His lifestyle and indiscretions now lay exposed to the press and the tax and judicial authorities. He was fair game. In the weeks after his trial, numerous sex workers came forward with kiss-and-tell stories involving Maradona. Cocaine-fueled nights, arranged on his behalf by associates. On the 17th of March 1991, following a game against Bari, Maradona was selected for a doping test. He recalled the moment himself. After the match, Materese, who was the president of the Federcalcio, a man born in Bari, didn't look at me with anger or bitterness. He just stared at me like the way the mafioso do, and I thought, at that moment, it's going to be very difficult to carry on living here. The test results showed traces of cocaine. The disciplinary commission of the Italian league hit Maradona with an unprecedented 15-month ban. No one from Napoli attended the sentencing. When FIFA later endorsed the sentence, Diego was banned from playing football worldwide. But before the ban took effect, he had time to make one final appearance for Napoli. On the 24th of March 1991, Maradona captained the Partenope away at Sampdoria. His side fell to a meek 4-1 defeat, but Maradona scored one final Serie A goal, a 75th minute penalty to momentarily make the score 3-1. With the 15-month ban commencing, Maradona wasted no time in fleeing Italy. He immediately flew home to Argentina. He left quietly, alone, and a broken man. The contrast from the raucous, adoring, hope-filled atmosphere of his arrival couldn't have been more stark. 2 weeks later, Diego was arrested at his home in Buenos Aires. He was under the influence of drugs and in possession of 1.5 grams of cocaine. The event was broadcast live on national television. This was a lesson for the subordinates, the poor in the slums who dared to dream. From Maradona's side, he insisted he was clean. Some, including Diego, saw it as the FIGC gaining revenge for his Argentina dumping Italy out of their own World Cup. Diego's trainer, Fernando Signorini, summed up the situation in the most logical way. No one was surprised to see Maradona test positive for cocaine, but the powers that be saw a great opportunity to finish him off. A political motive is hard to ignore. Many of the people closest to this story have their own version of everyone knew what was going on. Maradona was a long-term cocaine addict. He had played in Italy for 7 years and had never been caught. Unconfirmed reports claim that Maradona, with support from club members, had perfected the process of working around doping tests, especially in the build-up to Italia '90. This would typically involve using clean urine from someone else and providing a sample using a fake penis. But all that didn't matter anymore. The relationship was broken. The trust was gone. Maradona's behavior had caught up with him, and those who enabled it all seemingly cut him loose before the same happened to them. Maradona's drugs ban would end in the summer of 1992, freeing him up to play in the 1992-93 season. He would still only be 31 years old, but Diego had no intention of turning out in the blue of Napoli again. What had become a toxic romance with the club and Italy needed to be put out of its misery. It was apparent to all that both parties would be better off without the other. So, did Napoli and Maradona thrive in their respective new dawns? Sadly, that's a categoric no. Let's start with Napoli. During Maradona's 7 seasons in Naples, the club finished 8th, 3rd, 1st, 2nd, 2nd, 1st, and then, in a tumultuous last campaign that Diego didn't complete, 8th. This was a period of sustained success previously unprecedented in Napoli's history. After recovering to a 4th place finish in 91-92, during which a young Gianfranco Zola filled in for Maradona, they slumped into the also-rans category, finishing 11th, 6th, 7th, 12th, and 13th in the following 5 seasons. The days of competing against the Northern powers for the championship were already a fading memory. And then came the 97-98 season. In the 34-game campaign, Napoli recorded an astonishing 2 wins, and with only 8 draws, they were defeated a miserable 24 times. They were relegated away to Parma on the 11th of April 1998, with 5 games of the season remaining. By the end of it all, they had earned 14 points, an incredible 12 points behind Lecce, the team above them in 17th. In the Napoli edition of These Football Times, Josh Butler sums it up concisely. The ruination of Napoli was epic in its scope and calamity. Rumours about how Napoli had financed the Maradona transfer swirled around the San Paolo from day one. But in the mess of the acrimonious separation of the club and their Argentine superstar, the Italian authorities and Lega Calcio's interest in Napoli's financial affairs only grew. In 1993, Corrado Falena was initially forced into relinquishing control of Napoli due to his involvement in the Tangentopoli scandal, but that's another story. Falena sold Napoli to Elenio Gallo, but less than 2 years later he returned as the major shareholder, but not as president. The financial shambles he had left behind in 1993 wasn't the same. It was worse. The club had borrowed an enormous amount of money to pay for Maradona's transfer from Barcelona, but now Diego was gone and the team were in freefall. Attendances and gate receipts were dwindling. Throw in the mounting interest rates on the loan, and the numbers simply weren't adding up. Napoli were spiraling into debt. One look at the players sold by Napoli in the first half of the decade tells its own story. The aforementioned Zola was moved on to Parma, and Fabio Cannavaro, quite clearly the greatest talent the city had produced in a generation, soon followed. Benito Carbone, a 1994 signing from Torino, was sold to Inter a year later. Ciro Ferrara, a stalwart of those not-so-distant successes, reluctantly made the move north to Juventus, in the hope that his transfer fee would help the ailing Partenope. And then there were the quick turnarounds of Laurent Blanc, Freddy Rincon, Daniel Fonseca, and Roberto Ayala. In short, nothing was nailed down. The unsustainable financial model not only depleted the quality of the squad, it also did little to reduce debts to a manageable level. And while Falena had a huge part to play in this fall, there was another squeeze all too familiar to most Italian clubs. Napoli didn't own their stadium. Returning to Josh Butler in the Napoli edition of These Football Times, Napoli were merely tenants rather than owners of their own ground. So even with debts rising considerably, they were still obligated to pay extortionate rental fees to the local council, all the while presiding over a precipitous decline in average attendance. The much-needed immediate return to Serie A didn't materialize. What was once plain and obvious was now an existential threat. Napoli needed major structural change. Fellaino sold half of his shares in the club to a fellow entrepreneur, Giorgio Corbelli, in the summer of 2000. Corbelli offered all the familiar platitudes of restoring a fallen giant to its former glory. He even set about trying to liquidate Fellaino's remaining shares within a year in order to gain total control of the club. Despite the off-field struggles, Napoli returned to Serie A in 2000, but their stay was all too brief. They were immediately relegated the following season. It's fair to say that Neapolitans are a superstitious folk. Very few cities in the world can compete with Naples for legends, spirits, folklore and rituals designed to ward off evil. It's no surprise then that talk of curses started to grow around the San Paolo. Those whispers became groans of despair when the stadium, already showing its age, flooded during heavy rains in September 2001. Repair and renovation work was needed, so Napoli were forced to play home games elsewhere in the region. This unfortunate turn of events only compounded the club's financial woes. First, there was the bill for the repairs, but then there was an even greater drop in gate receipts and merchandise sales that would have come from playing at the San Paolo. There was no return to Serie A. Napoli's worsening financial situation made progress impossible, so Giorgio Corbelli cashed out after only 2 years. He sold his shares to Salvatore Naldi, the head of a group in the hotel and restaurant sector. After 3 miserable years stuck in Serie B, Napoli were finally issued with a winding up order at the end of the 2003-04 season. They had accumulated enormous debts, with estimated figures ranging from €62 million to €79 million. The civil tribunal of Naples declared the club bankrupt, and they were expelled from the league. In August 2004, Naples was a city bereft, and while tears were openly shed for this catastrophic collapse, there was a glimmer of hope. The Italian government had recently passed a law known as Lodo Petrucci, which allowed a city whose club had collapsed to retain a franchise under a new company. This meant that Naples could retain a professional football team. 4 companies wasted no time in stepping forward to compete for the franchise. The prospects were encouraging, if unglamorous. That is until Aurelio De Laurentiis entered the race. This was, after all, the son of movie producer Dino De Laurentiis, who had produced 500 films in Italy and Hollywood. Aurelio had previously tried to buy Napoli back in 1999, but his bid was rejected. Now, however, his advance was a formality, and he became the new owner of the club in September 2004. Upon taking the reins, he declared, "A new era is beginning, and I hope the fans have the patience and respect for this club that it requires." Following their financial collapse, Napoli were kicked out of the league. They would start the 2004-05 campaign and this new era in the depths of Serie C1, the third tier of Italian football, and they would do so under the name Napoli Soccer 2004. With just 2 weeks to assemble a squad, it's no surprise that promotion evaded them at the first attempt. But the Partenopei only had to face one more season in C1. They were promoted back to Serie B for the 2006-07 season. Here, they unexpectedly locked horns with Juventus again, with the old lady demoted to the second tier following the Calciopoli scandal. Both fallen giants gained promotion back to Serie A, along with Genoa. So, for the 2007-08 season, Napoli were back in the top flight of Italian football. At this point, De Laurentiis also bought back the rights to the name Società Sportiva Calcio Napoli, restoring the club's identity along with their pride. De Laurentiis' leadership had been marked by caution and frugality. The recklessness of the Fellaino years was a fading memory. The transfer strategy then focused on finding hidden gems that the club could develop and then sell for big money if and when the time came. In these early years of their return to Serie A, this approach secured the services of Marek Hamšík and Ezequiel Lavezzi. Edinson Cavani would then join them in 2010. Under the guidance of Walter Mazzarri, Napoli cemented themselves as a fixture at the top end of the table again. In his first full season, Napoli finished third. Then, in 2011-12, Mazzarri's side secured Napoli's first national cup since 1987. And the 2-0 defeat of Juventus, who would go the league season unbeaten, only made the first silverware of the new era even sweeter. During the same season, Napoli also made their first appearance in the Champions League since their ill-fated campaign in 1990-91 with Maradona. They've been regulars, if not a permanent face, ever since. Even when Lavezzi was sold to PSG in 2012, the club used savvy rather than cash to ease the pain. The homegrown Lorenzo Insigne was promoted to the first team and would go on to have such a successful career that he earned the nickname Il Magnifico. Following Mazzarri's resignation to join Inter, Rafael Benitez took over the San Paolo hot seat, and in his first season he secured Napoli's second Coppa Italia in 3 years, defeating Fiorentina 3-1 in the final. Arguably of equal importance, the first signing of the Spaniard's reign was Dries Mertens from PSV. The diminutive Belgian would work wonders with Insigne, as he went on to become the club's all-time record goalscorer. Insigne sits second on this list, with Hamšík in third. The unheralded Maurizio Sarri would replace Benitez and, over 3 incredible seasons, led Napoli to second, third and second-placed finishes. The latter of these came in 2017-18, when Napoli racked up a remarkable club record 91 points. The only problem was that old foes Juventus earned 95 of their own on the way to yet another championship. Gennaro Gattuso took over when Sarri left for Chelsea. While his reign was mixed, he led Napoli to their 6th Coppa Italia victory in 2019-20 after defeating Juventus on penalties following a 0-0 draw in normal time. But all these cup successes and close calls in the league were building to something special. By the start of the 2022-23 season, Napoli's squad had undergone one of its periodic evolutions. In the previous years, star names like Jorginho, Kalidou Koulibaly, Lorenzo Insigne and Dries Mertens had moved on, either cashed in at the height of their value or considered old enough to require replacing. As part of the squad churn, fresher, younger heroes in waiting had arrived, including Victor Osimhen, Kvicha Kvaratskhelia and Kim Min-jae, to name only 3. But the reality is, the entire squad, led by manager Luciano Spalletti, would write their names into Napoli folklore. On the 4th of May 2023, Napoli drew 1-1 away at Udinese, Victor Osimhen cancelling out Sandy Lovric's opener. The point was enough to secure Napoli the Serie A title with 5 games to spare. Finally, after descending to hell and clawing their way back out, Napoli were at the summit of Italian football again. 33 years had passed since their second Maradona-inspired championship win, and the city embraced pandemonium for days, if not weeks. When the championship returned to Naples, however, Napoli's stadium carried the name Stadio Diego Armando Maradona. Sadly, this third incarnation was a posthumous honour. Diego Maradona passed away in Buenos Aires on the 25th of November 2020 at the age of just 60. On the 30th of October of the same year, his 60th birthday, Diego appeared at a tribute event during which he looked visibly unwell. 3 days later, on the 2nd of November, he was admitted to a hospital in La Plata. According to an article on Marca.com, he was due to have a CT scan that night, but it was pushed back to the next day because the equipment was allegedly not working as it should. The scan in the morning subsequently uncovered a subdural hematoma. Now, I'm no doctor, but in layman's terms, this is when blood collects between the covering of the brain and the surface of the brain. Maradona underwent surgery on his hematoma at the Clinica Olivos. The procedure, performed by his personal doctor, Leopoldo Luque, took 80 minutes to complete and was deemed a success. After staying in the hospital under supervision, Diego was given the all-clear on the 11th of November. He returned home to recover. The next news to break was the shocking and devastating reports of his death on the 25th. Maradona had suffered a heart attack and could not be resuscitated. At the time of writing in 2025, numerous medical professionals are undergoing trial, accused of negligence during his final days. Maradona's death was the heartbreaking final chapter in a tumultuous life, particularly after leaving Napoli. When Diego's 15-month drug ban ended in the summer of 1992, he was looking for a new club. His relationship with those in charge at Napoli was beyond repair. But still, he was under contract and the club held his registration. In fact, Corrado Faleno wanted to reintegrate the one-way Argentine into the team. But Maradona's mind was set, so the situation ground to a halt. At the very least, Faleno didn't want to become known as the man who let Maradona leave for pennies, or even nothing. And given Napoli's dire financial position, any transfer fee he could squeeze from an interested club would be most welcome. Again, this is Maradona we're talking about. He was more of a liability than ever, had gained weight, and was stuck with a bruised and battered body. But this was a man who could, and had, pulled miracles before. And still a few months shy of his 32nd birthday, who knew what wonders he might conjure? Maradona's preference was a return to Boca Juniors, but they simply couldn't afford him. Marseille continued to sniff around, but it was Sevilla who surprisingly took pole position in negotiations. Carlos Bilardo, the man who had overseen Argentina's 1986 World Cup triumph, was manager of the Andalusians. There were echoes of 1984 too. Sevilla were another underachieving team in a poor, stigmatized region, looked down on by those in more affluent northern areas. All things considered, the project was impossible to resist. Sevilla's initial bid was rejected by Napoli. The Spaniards balked, unsure if a greater investment was a wise use of limited money, but Bilardo was insistent. Enter Sepp Blatter, at the time General Secretary of FIFA. World football's governing body had a vested interest in a fit and firing Maradona appearing at the 1994 World Cup in the United States, a market they were desperate to crack. They wanted to get the deal done quickly. The sooner Maradona got back on the field, the more likely he was to be ready in time. Blatter mediated a meeting between Sevilla and Napoli representatives at FIFA HQ, no less. The Spanish club agreed to pay the Neapolitans £4.5 million for Maradona. But there was one final quirk to proceedings. It later emerged that Mediaset, a broadcasting company owned by Milan president Silvio Berlusconi, had covered a huge chunk of the transfer fee. There was a double benefit for Berlusconi here. First, Mediaset had negotiated broadcasting rights for a series of showpiece friendlies that Maradona would feature in for Sevilla, including games against Bayern Munich, Paul Gascoigne's Lazio, Sao Paulo, Porto, and Galatasaray. There was even a homecoming friendly against Boca Juniors at La Bombonera. The second benefit for Berlusconi was the removal of any lingering threat that Maradona posed in Serie A. Despite phenomenal success in Europe, Milan hadn't won the Italian championship since 1988. City rivals Inter, a Maradona-inspired Napoli, and the remarkable Sampdoria side had secured the subsequent 3 titles. Who, you ask, went on to win the next 3 league titles? Berlusconi's Milan. Having a collection of the world's finest players certainly helped. So, did Maradona power the previously mediocre Sevilla to glory like he did in Italy with Napoli? No. Having not played consistent football for 2 years, Maradona was out of shape and out of rhythm. But sudden flashes of that old brilliance would still spark, and he struck up a decent partnership with a young Davor Suker. Overall, Maradona's form was fine, and Sevilla were performing better than expected. But he saved his greatest performance in Spain, some say including his spell at Barcelona, for a home game against Real Madrid. The revitalized Diego ran the show, controlling the game and running rings around such esteemed names as Fernando Hierro and Manolo Sanchis. The 2-0 victory took Sevilla into the top 3 of La Liga. As 1992 gave way to 1993, Maradona's situation in Spain soured. Sevilla didn't treat Maradona like a deity. He was just another player to them. So as Diego's ego continued to grow with his slow return to form, so a divide between him, the club, and its fans started to appear. In February 1993, Diego requested permission to represent Argentina in 2 fixtures. The first was on Friday the 19th of February against Brazil in the AFA Centenary game. The second was on Wednesday the 24th against Denmark in the Artemio Franchi Cup, a tie between the Copa America and the European Championship winners. Sevilla countered, requesting that he only play in one of the games because they needed him to play a La Liga fixture against Logroñés on Sunday the 21st. Maradona chose to defy his club and play in the 2 Argentina games, both of which were in South America. He even took compatriot and Sevilla teammate Diego Simeone along for the ride on his private jet. So, Maradona flew tens of thousands of miles across multiple time zones to play in all 3 games. To make matters worse, he put in an awful showing against Logroñés to keep himself fresh for Argentina's game against Denmark, angering many at Sevilla. Old habits die hard, and Maradona's vices started to surface in Seville. There were reports of Diego frequenting nightclubs deep into the night, and he received police penalties for driving his Porsche around the city at high speeds. Enough consternation was caused for Sevilla president Luis Cuervas to hire a private detective to shadow Maradona. But to put it simply, the Argentine was uncontrollable. The situation with manager Bilardo came to a head following a home game against Real Burgos, the penultimate game of the season. Maradona asked to be substituted due to a persistent knee problem causing him unbearable pain. But because of the promising first half, Bilardo requested that Diego take painkilling injections at half-time, so he duly obliged. Only a few minutes after the restart, Bilardo substituted Maradona anyway. Furious at having taken yet another painkilling jab for no reason, Diego unleashed. After staring daggers at his manager on his way off the pitch, Maradona launched into a foul-mouthed tirade and smashed up the dressing room. An equally incensed Bilardo demanded a face-to-face apology. The subsequent meeting ended up getting physical, with Maradona saying that the two, quote, kicked the shit out of each other. Maradona had rapidly fallen out of favour with the Sevilla fans, manager and board. Less than a year after signing, he was out. Sevilla's vice president offered his thoughts as a parting gift. In his words, Maradona was, quote, not fit to play golf. After 3 successive acrimonious exits from clubs in Europe, Maradona headed home to Argentina. After almost returning to Argentinos Juniors, he signed for Newell's Old Boys, but it was over before it really began. He only managed 5 competitive starts and didn't score any goals. He departed in January 1994 after disagreeing with the change in the club's presidency. In the meantime, the Argentina national team had made a mess of their World Cup qualifying campaign and found themselves in a qualifying playoff with Australia. It seemed the entire nation called in unison for El Diego to save them. He stepped up. Maradona played in both legs of the playoff, setting up Abel Balbo to score in the first leg in Sydney, which ended 1-1. With Maradona in the side again for the second leg, Argentina saw off the Australians 1-0 for a 2-1 aggregate victory. But the situation had taken its toll on the team's talisman. In February 1994, Maradona pulled out of contention for the World Cup squad, citing the enormous pressure being placed on him. The mental burden was too much for even him to handle. Happy to prove his point, the press set up camp outside his house for 2 days. They demanded an explanation for the decision. Presumably aggravated at having already provided that explanation, Maradona shunned words and opted for an air rifle. He shot into the crowd of news crews and hit 4 people. The police arrived. Legal action was taken. Maradona was essentially without a club in the lead-up to the World Cup, with appearances in the courtroom replacing those on the football pitch. The end of Diego's playing career was looming, but this was a man who found a fiery inspiration when he had a cause to fight for. This time, the cause was himself and the chance to play at what would surely be his final World Cup. When the Argentina squad was announced, Maradona was included. In Argentina's opening game of the tournament, they trounced a poor Greece side 4-0. On the hour mark, Maradona completed his remarkable comeback, albeit perhaps a dubiously fueled one. After a neat one-touch passing move on the edge of the Greek penalty area, Maradona curled a sumptuous shot into the top corner, putting the Albi Celeste 3 up. Argentina's number 10 celebrated in a fashion that raised some eyebrows. The image of Diego running toward a sideline camera, roaring unintelligibly, his mouth gaping, his eyes bulging, has become as much a part of his iconography as the hand of God. Around the world, people slouched on sofas were forgiven for claiming, "I think he might be on something, you know." 4 days later, Argentina faced off against Nigeria. Again, Maradona was in the thick of the action, assisting Claudio Caniggia in a 2-1 win. Unbeknownst to him and everyone watching, this would be Maradona's last appearance for his country. Diego was selected for post-match drug testing. His results came back positive. Maradona's system contained ephedrine, a drug used by asthmatics. When applied to sports performance, the substance, which is a central nervous system stimulant, can boost energy, reduce fatigue, improve aerobic performance, and sharpen alertness and reaction time. Ephedrine is also found in some over-the-counter cold medicines. The latter point is what Maradona protested his innocence around. He had apparently had a cold the night before the Nigeria game and asked Signorini, his trainer, for help. Conversely, Michel de Jorge, a FIFA doctor, claimed it was impossible to find the 5 strains of ephedrine in Maradona's urine sample in a single medicine. Of course, Maradona protested his innocence. In his version of events, he had done nothing but work his ass off and bust his balls like never before to make himself fit for the tournament. He labelled events as a real dirty business and proclaimed, "They cut off my legs and wouldn't let me defend myself. I didn't use drugs. I don't know what happened. I swear that I wasn't doped, but I see that they don't care." The AFA's representative for Maradona's second sample test also claimed foul play during the process, only deepening the conspiracy theory. The scandal derailed Argentina's World Cup campaign. Romania eliminated them in the last 16. Maradona was fined and handed another 15-month ban from football. During his layoff, Diego took his first steps into management with Deportivo Mandiu. The spell lasted only 2 months, after which Maradona left following arguments with the board. In his 12 games as coach, he won only 1. In January 1995, he then took his second managerial role at Racing Club. While his stay there was twice as long, his record at the end of 4 months in charge was 11 games played, 2 wins, 6 draws, and 3 defeats. But all this felt like a sideshow as Maradona's ban ticked down to completion in September 1995. There seemed only one logical destination for Diego to see out his playing days: Boca Juniors. The fans at La Bombonera welcomed their former darling back with open arms. Maradona had left a boy, but he returned a man noticeably weathered by battering storms, some of his own making, some handed down by unfortunate twists of fate. While Diego's official return for Boca came in a friendly in Seoul, South Korea, he finally stepped out onto La Bombonera turf again on the 7th of October 1995 in a game against Colón. The stadium heaved with anticipation, the people present overcome with joy at the mere sight of this demigod, clad in blue and yellow again. In his next appearance, Diego scored the first goal of his second spell, a perfectly placed free kick. In fact, only one of his goals in his 2 years at Boca would come from open play, a pattern indicative of his physical decline. But while the pace and agility may have gone, his footballing brain was still razor sharp. In August 1997, Maradona scored another penalty against Argentinos Juniors. His celebration, which included a forward roll and a leap up the fence at the front of the stand, had echoes of the infamous scenes following his goal against Greece in 1994. Sure enough, a post-match drugs test came back with traces of cocaine. The ensuing ban would bring the final curtain down on Maradona's playing career. But there was one final glimmer of light. While Maradona's appeal was processed, he was able to play one final game, a Super Classico against River Plate on the 25th of October 1997. Running on empty with a broken body, he was substituted at half-time, replaced by a young Juan Román Riquelme. Diego announced his retirement days later on the 30th of October, his 37th birthday. Maradona's post-retirement life saw an endless battle with addiction, ongoing weight issues, and increasingly erratic behavior. But all this was mixed with godlike adulation wherever he went. His untimely death sent shockwaves through the footballing world. The grief was most profound in two places, Buenos Aires and Naples. In the latter, thousands took to the streets to mourn, lighting flares, singing songs, and paying tribute to the man who had given them the greatest years in their club's history. In December 2020, Napoli bestowed their stadium with the name Stadio Diego Armando Maradona, an everlasting tribute to the player who had not only brought unimaginable success, but had given the city a greater sense of identity and pride. In death, Diego Maradona's connection to SSC Napoli became eternal, although it felt as though it always had been.